Good morning. Today we're talking about the California Gold Rush and the war with Mexico. And before we get to any of that, starting off with a journal entry if you choose to do this, what do you think of the following quote? Do you agree or do you disagree? I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, and its stupidity. That was said by Dwight David Eisenhower, also known as Ike. He was the supreme Allied commander during World War II, and he was also later president of the United States during the 1950s. Do you agree with him? Do you disagree with him? Write a few sentences or so, and when you're done with that, unpause the video and go ahead and continue on with the notes. For those of you starting the notes, though, open up your notes to a brand new page at the very top. The Gold Rush and War with Mexico. So to begin with here, today's target, what I want you guys to understand is I want you to know and describe what happened during the California Gold Rush and understand how America gained land during the Mexican-American War. And that'll become pretty clear by the time we're done with this today. So focusing on the West here, we've been talking about westward expansion. We've been talking about events like the Texas Revolution. I hope you saw those notes. If not, stop this video, go watch it, because you need to know those notes before you cover these. But today we're focusing on California. So California originally belonged to Mexico just like Texas had, although they were inviting Americans over to be able to get land grants. And one day there was a fairly wealthy American named John Sutter who received permission to start a colony near the Sacramento River. He was hoping to become a land baron, somebody who owned a lot of land and wanted to produce a sawmill and lumber and become even wealthier producing timber. He gets permission to start a colony near the Sacramento River. And along the way, as he establishes this colony for people who are moving west, it becomes more of a rest stop for other people in their journeys to go west. So they usually travel and buy supplies at his fort that's there, things like that. Now, in 1846, at the same time as the Mexican-American War, there is a huge rebellion in California. And the Americans who live in California, very similar to Texas, they rebel against the Mexican government. There are some battles, and eventually they win their independence and become their own small country, their own republic called the California Republic. Okay? So you need to know that, because what happens next is a huge deal. In 1846, California becomes its own country. Unfortunately for the Mexican government, who just lost this land, what they didn't realize is there's gold in this territory, and they just miss out on being able to exploit that for themselves. See, the gold rush starts actually on John Sutter's land near his mill. It's 1848, 2 years after California has won its independence from Mexico. And one day, one of John Sutter's employees, a guy named James Marshall, is helping to build a water wheel out in the Sacramento River. And as they're taking a break, he's just standing off the side near the edge of the river. He looks down and he sees a shiny little pebble, and he doesn't quite know what it is. He reaches down, he picks it up, and he realizes this pea-sized pebble is a pure gold nugget. He's so excited, he runs up immediately to John Sutter and says, "Hey, I think I've discovered gold here." He goes around to all of his friends and some of the Native Americans who are living in the area and tells them, "Hey, there's gold here." And Sutter tells them, "We need to keep this quiet. We don't want anybody to know about this because we want to keep this all for ourselves." He's really worried about a whole bunch of people suddenly moving in and staking claims on his land. But he goes around telling his employees, "Don't tell anyone." Well, somebody spills the beans. We have no idea who it is, but less than 2 weeks later, news breaks out, and newspapers all over the country know that there is gold in California, and people start moving to California in droves. Within a year, tens of thousands of Americans are moving west, hoping to stake a claim and dig for gold and become wealthy overnight. This is why they call this the gold rush. It literally just explodes. In fact, this is what San Francisco looks like in 1847, the year before gold is discovered. It's a population of 800 people, sparse homes, not a lot of folks that live there. This is what California looks like in San Francisco just a few years later after the gold rush. This is Sacramento in 1850. By this time, the population of just this one town is 25,000 people. It is literally just exploded with people. Everybody's rushing west to try and stake a claim. Now, most people move over in 1849, and they become known as the 49ers. The folks who move out to dig for gold that year, they're called the 49ers, which also is why to this day San Francisco's football team is called the 49ers. In fact, if you look at most sports teams, almost every sports team, especially in football, but in a lot of different sports as well, like, hey, Portland Trail Blazers, are named after historical events or people. The Oilers, again, named after historical events or things that happened in that area. Most sports teams, hey, reflect history. So if you like sports, you like history. It's one of those automatic things. Of course, when you traveled over out west to be a miner, life was not great for a miner. Typically, you lived in a tent, you slept on the cold, hard ground. It was pretty miserable. You didn't have lots of good food to eat. Most of your money got spent on buying supplies because many of them came out and didn't end up having the proper supplies to begin with to mine for gold. Most of the miners themselves didn't become wealthy. It was the people that were selling them supplies that became really wealthy from this thing, because in those days, a shovel and a pickaxe would cost $50 in their day's worth of money, which is several $1,000s nowadays. Imagine going down to Ace Hardware or Walmart and the prices for a shovel is $2,000. That is what most miners were faced with, and because of that, most merchants got super wealthy during this time. So did several women. A lot of women moved west to provide entertainment to men. I'm going to leave it at that kind of a description, but it starts a whole industry in California, which in many ways continues to this day. They become very wealthy over this as well. That's where you get nightclub girls and the chorus girls moving out west that you see in saloons, typical of the time period. So merchants and women did fairly well out here, but the miners themselves, it didn't pan out for them, literally. And yes, for those of you who didn't catch it, that's my first pun in a while. So there you go. So California's population, it leads to a huge boom in the economy. People are making money, mostly merchants, not the miners so much. And because of that, within a very short time, California is added as a U.S. state. It actually gets added before Oregon does, even though we own that territory first. We're going to go ahead and skip that and move on to the war with Mexico. So that's the California Gold Rush. Now, at the same time, well, right before the Gold Rush, kind of while these events are happening, America goes to war with Mexico. So let's go ahead and begin the war with Mexico. Now, the war lasts for just over 2 years, almost 3 years, from 1846 to 1848. And this happens right before the California Gold Rush. In fact, if it hadn't happened, all that gold could have been claimed by Mexico if they had held on to the land. So they really missed out on their timing here. This whole war happens because of a boundary dispute, because both Mexico and America could not agree on what the border between those two nations would be. Here's what ended up happening, okay? So it's a big border dispute. What's going on is that when Texas had become its own country, when Santa Anna lost during the Texas Revolution and they basically tell him, we're forcing you to sign a treaty, they agree on a specific river as a boundary. Now, this river is the Rio Grande River, which stretches right here. So Texans and then later Americans, once Texas becomes a state, believe that this land from that white line over to the United States is owned by Texas and no longer owned by the Mexican government. So for 10 years, Texas is its own country, and then eventually it becomes a state. It takes them 10 years to get admitted because Texas allows slavery, and America at the time allows slavery in about half of their states, and there's a lot of debate on whether or not new states should be added in as slave states or free states. So it takes 10 years for Texas to be added as a state. They are. And when Texas is added as a state in 1846, the Texans believe the border is the Rio Grande, which is that river right there. Now, during that 10 years of Texas becoming a brand new country and then later becoming a state, the Mexican government had changed. Santa Anna had been sent into exile. He was no longer part of the government, and the Mexican government that was in place did not recognize the treaty, especially the part where it granted this boundary. The Mexican government capitulated enough to say, okay, yes, Texas is its own country, but they believe the boundary is this river right over here, the Nueces River. And in doing so, they believe that from that river, the yellow line you see on the screen, all the way to the left to Mexico is all Mexican territory. What that meant overall is that all this land in between the two rivers, right there, is disputed territory. America believes it owns that land. Mexico believes it owns that land. Now, under the original treaty with Santa Anna, technically the United States owns this land. But the Mexican government doesn't recognize that treaty. This is no man's land. It's disputed territory, and when both sides make claim to this territory, it's going to lead to war. Now, the president of the time is James K. Polk, and he wants more territory. He wants America to expand. He offers to buy California from Mexico. They refuse him twice. He offers to buy other parts of land that Mexico owns, and they absolutely refuse. In fact, they want to reclaim this land in Texas that's under dispute. Now, Polk does not want to lose any land that he believes he already owns. So to try and have a firmer claim on the territory, Polk sends American troops, a small detachment of cavalry, to go to that disputed territory and basically say, hey, no, this is all our land up to the Rio Grande. The Mexican government believes the same thing. They own the land, so they send in troops as well. And for a day or two, it seems like it's just troops within this border, but eventually the Mexican troops fire on the American troops, take them by surprise, and capture some as prisoners. Now, at the same time that all of these things happen, these skirmishes happen, a familiar guy shows up. Santa Anna comes back out of exile and says, basically he plays both sides. He goes to the Mexican government and says, hey, if you bring me back, I won't be your president, I just want to be a general, and I will help kick these Americans out of this territory and reclaim the land that we lost 10 years earlier. We'll get Texas back. But at the same time, he's also secretly negotiating with America and saying, hey, you know what, if you help me kind of get me back into this Mexican government, if you open up diplomatic channels with me and say that you're only going to talk through me, then if I get into power in Mexico, I'll negotiate a treaty with you and you'll end up getting the land that we originally agreed to. He's playing both sides. But the Mexican government and the United States buy it. They say, hey, this seems legit. The Mexican government invites Santa Anna back in as a general, and he immediately seizes power. He becomes president and then swears up, you know what, we're just going to kick all these people out of Texas and continue the war, and completely reneges on all the promises that he's made. But going back to the original skirmish, when American troops are fired upon, this starts the war. Mexico kills U.S. soldiers in the disputed territory. Now, of course, Mexico claims that, hey, we are defending our land from an invasion. So from their point of view, this seems legit. Hey, they're defending against an invasion. From the American point of view, President Polk goes up to Congress and says, hey, American lives have been killed on American soil. Both sides are angry. The American government, the Congress, immediately declares war. War against Mexico begins. Then the U.S. invades. Now, Santa Anna, in the meantime, he's building up an army. And he has sworn to the Mexican people that he's going to retake all of Texas. This is basically the Texas Revolution redone, part 2, if you want to call it. And he starts an invasion force going into Texas all over again. Now, at the same time, the President of the United States, James Polk, he comes up with a plan with Congress to be able to fight this war, and it's a 3-part plan. Number 1, he says that we need to drive the Mexican troops out of the disputed territory and claim this land and make sure that what caused this war to begin with is held by American troops. Then he says we need to claim New Mexico and California, the areas that he had offered to buy from Mexico beforehand. He sees this as a chance to be able to expand west even more into Mexican territory. And finally, the third part of his war plan is to invade Mexico itself, send troops down to Mexico City, and hopefully capture the city and Santa Anna and force them to surrender. And that's the plan that we follow for this 2.5-3 year war. So looking at the map here, there are Mexican troops in the disputed territory, well, troops are sent in to push them back. At the same exact time, the American army invades into Mexico, and there are battles throughout. I'm not going to get into too much detail on all of these battles, but suffice it to say that within just a few weeks, the Mexican army is pushed back out of the American territory, at least what the Americans claim to be their territory, and within a few weeks, the American army has successfully invaded into Mexico itself. And again, there's all kinds of battles during this time. One of my favorites is a battle that happens right outside of Mexico City, because Santa Anna has his forces up on 3 different hills, and he believes that his forces are completely well defended. Nothing can take them down. There is a 4th hill next to them, and he believes there is no way any military on the planet can get any weapons on top of that hill. He doesn't consider it an important hill, even though it's taller than his 3 positions. And during this battle, the American army, led by a general called Winfield Scott, calls up one of his best captains, whose name is Robert E. Lee. He'll later be a really important figure in the American Civil War about 20 years after this. But Captain Robert E. Lee is ordered to place cannons on top of this 4th hill, which everybody believes is completely impossible. Even animals can't climb to the top of this hill. Somehow, and I don't know exactly how they managed to this, digging into the hill, creating pathways and roads that could not have existed on their own naturally, they spend a day and they manage to get all of the American artillery up on this hill. The next morning, Santa Anna is so surprised by this artillery that starts shelling all of his entrenched positions, he immediately orders a retreat. They have to retreat so quickly that Santa Anna himself, who, by the way, has a wooden peg leg at this time, he's being forced to retreat so quickly, he doesn't even have time to be able to attach his peg leg. He leaves it behind. The American army captures it as a prisoner of war, and to this day, it remains in the Illinois State Military Museum. As spoils of war, they captured it from him. No joke. And then they continued after they've pushed the Mexican army out of this area to surround Mexico City and bombard it. So then really the war ends when Mexico is surrounded, Mexico City is surrounded. Places like Veracruz, a port city, are taken by the American troops. The war starts in April, and by September of the next year, a lot of Mexican territories are taken, and most of the war is done even by that point. Well, eventually the American army invades, surrounds Mexico City itself, and Mexico City and the government is forced to surrender. So by September 1847, American forces have captured Mexico City. They basically tell them, well, hey, you've got an option here. We can sign a treaty and you can hand over some territory, or we can continue to destroy all of your forces and take all of your territory. And there are many Americans living at the time who believe that Mexico should have fallen, and that they should have demanded all the territory, and that basically Mexico should have become a colony of the United States at this point. Polk doesn't want to appear like he's being too greedy with this. He's already being really greedy. He's going to end up asking for half of the Mexican territory. It's going to add California, the disputed zone in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, all of this southwestern territory of the United States that is what we have today. But he doesn't want to take it all because he doesn't want the international countries and community to condemn his actions. They sign a treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and with that the war ends. And basically what happens during this treaty is Mexico agrees to give up all claims to Texas. They fix the border strictly at the Rio Grande River, which you shouldn't say river at the end of Rio Grande, because Rio Grande means large river. So basically by writing it that way, it says large river. But anyhow, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and other territories are added, and we agree to buy those territories as part of this treaty for $15 million, which is pretty much a steal. By the end of this war, the Mexican-American War, by the end of this, the United States has pretty much taken the shape that we're familiar with today, minus Hawaii, minus Alaska, and minus a little bit of territory right below Arizona. But pretty much the lower 48 states of America and the shape that it takes looks like what we have now after war with Mexico. And that's the Mexican-American War. I hope you guys enjoyed.